But at night, if you were on the river, it was another thing. You felt the land taking you back to something that was familiar, something you had known at some time but had forgotten or ignored, but which was always there. I just really like that. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Read Good, Draw Bad, where we love to read really good and draw pretty darn bad. Today we are reading a very interesting book, V.S. Naipaul's book, A Bend in the River, where we visit an unnamed African town on the height of social change and political unrest. And just so you know, I'm doing a reading challenge where I'm reading the top 100 novels of the 20th century as decided by the Modern Library. And this book is one of those books. You can find out more in the description below. First, a TLDR on this book. This book is a historical fiction, and it's definitely a composite of various experiences of V.S. Naipaul, the author. This book takes place in an unnamed African town that's very important to both African and European political and trade, as in commercial, interests. At the center of all of this political turmoil and unrest, we find a young man, Salim, who is of East Indian descent, who moves to this small town at the behest and recommendation of his mentor and father figure, Nasruddin. As this small town grows into a commercial trade center, it becomes a spotlight of importance for African political figures and the colonial interests of European trade. And it also garners the attention of people with ideologies and people who are activists who see different ways that the world of East and West Africa could be. And these different groups and different ideologies clash in ways that cause a lot of violence and political unrest. And we start the book with Salim just starting out his commercial journey as a small business owner. Salim tells us within the book that he's looking to make his own mark on the world away from the eyes of his parents or his own community, but where he can stand on his own in a very individualistic way that really represents kind of modern Western concepts of someone making it on their own. Nasruddin recommends that Salim opens his small business in this town because Nasruddin believes that this town, where there's a bend in the river, will become a commercial trade hub where Salim can start to make a little bit of money. Now, his family won't let him go alone, so instead he takes along one of his family's slaves. And yes, there's a lot about slavery in this book, so get ready. Salim is joined by his family slave Mehdi, who is kind of like a brother figure to Salim in this book. Mehdi is a curious and adventurous young man who wants to live at peace in the African community where he finds himself, and eventually, because of Mehdi, various young African men from various tribes start visiting Salim's small shop, including Ferdinand, who becomes an important character later in the book. Ferdinand is a young, black African tribal male who has come into what he considers the big city to try and get ahead in life, and goes to get a school education from one of the Western schools. So it was called a lycée. Because his mother from one of the tribes who frequented Salim's shop asks Salim to look out for Ferdinand to help him become integrated with what she saw as the future of African society, which is integrating with all these new Western ideals. As Salim's business grows, he starts to interact with the intellectuals who have come to the town, including Raymond, who is a big political speechwriter and thinker for the person called the Big Man, who is kind of like this unnamed, very mysterious, but very dangerous political leader who wants to unite Africa under his rule, who parades around in the general public as a kind of peacemaker and change maker in society, when in reality, he has the whole force of the African armies behind him. After meeting Raymond, he then meets Raymond's wife, Yvette. And Yvette is a central character in Salim's life as a femme fatale who gets together with Salim behind Raymond's back because both of them are looking to kind of find some sort of love and peace and safety in a place where there's a lot of turmoil and a lot of political unrest and feels like a very dangerous kind of place. Salim is looking to try and get with a woman who has that mysterious Western air to her, I think. She really is a femme fatale in this book. Yvette and Salim share similar values, but their love affair is more of a distraction from all the political unrest that's building over time in their town. And I have to mention, because this is something that gave me the ick later in the book, because their love affair comes to a very quick end Once Salim gets very angry with her and he beats Yvette very seriously. So I have to put a little warning here. There's some domestic violence in this book. So just a little trigger warning there. There is some domestic violence in here. It's a one-time thing, but it is unpleasant. Thematically, this book is very easy to understand. It's about progress, business, societal values, and the impact of British colonization. And of course, with progress comes the question, who gets hurt by progress? Now, in this book, progress comes in many forms. The town Salim lives in slowly acquires fast food restaurants, interesting and prestigious hotels where European guests can come and stay, a lycée or a special international school that will accept both African students and European students, and various small businesses like Salim's are starting to benefit from the increased tourist attraction that this town in the bend in the river is starting to become. The book starts very hopefully that modern ideals and Western ideals will flourish in this small African town, but this whole idea is eventually ruined by political upheaval and the influence of the big man as he slowly comes into the town to get rid of any terrorists or any dissenters who do not like him. Now, business and commercial success is a theme to explore in this book because how can a small business get ahead in an environment like a very volatile, politically volatile small town? Because Salim's life revolves around taking Nasruddin's advice, building up his shop from a 2 to a 15, which is to say to exponentially increase his business's value. And Salim's goal eventually is to try and become and replicate Nasruddin's success. However, he is unable to do this because he is completely stopped by the political strife and the interference of government officials in his business once government corruption starts to affect all of his profits. And Salim ultimately fails to become a business success because of the political corruption and almost ends up losing his life in this book because of the interference of various political factions. Thematically, the values of different cultures are put on display in this book for everyone to read about and decide if they're either true and or valuable. And the author definitely encourages us to ask, what kind of society should we have so that people can be successful? Between traditional African cultures, which want one kind of society, the new Western, modernized, influential thinking that allows fast food restaurants to grow in the small town, and also the political interests of who wants to be ruling this small town, which seems to be just a regular small town, but people have a very big interest in it as a sort of commercial center. Because once ideas become the most important thing to African people and to the European and African leaders who are clashing, the people who are caught in the crossfire are people at the level of Salim, like small businesses, local Africans, and others who are honestly just victims. Salim eventually needs to start bribing army officials and police officials simply to survive and to keep his business running. And it was written in such a way that I very seriously felt the stress and the uncertainty Salim felt as being part of a military regime where he needed to stay in line or get shot in the process. Lastly, the theme of colonization is really important to this book, and it's also really difficult to read about. The first 2 chapters are about the different kinds of slavery in Africa and how there's different kinds of slaves. And a big part of this book is about trying to understand all the issues related to European influences and African warlords and how they clashed at the time. So something to keep in mind if you decide to read this book. Now, on to the review. I really loved this book, but I'm not sure that I can say I completely understood this book because it touched on cultures and historical issues that I only have like the smallest of references to. But what this book did ask me to do, and what I felt compelled to do as doing part of this book review, is I read up a lot more on different kinds of problems that happened in Africa and the various wars and the various leaders that caused problems in Africa, like mentioned by the big man in this book. I also think a book like this is bound to be incredibly controversial because V.S. Naipaul touches on subjects that I think a lot of people don't want to talk about. Because this is unflinching in its desire, this book, to describe the different ways and problems that various kinds of thinking lead to. So while it's good that there's sort of traditionalism in sort of African culture, it still needs to grapple with the fact that colonial forces and influences have arrived and they're not going away. And I think you can both love and hate this book for its desire to show an unflinching look at the way it portrays Europeans, Africans, and others. And like any book that's about a small town, in this case a small town in Africa, people love to hate on books about small towns, especially if there's any shred of truth in it, and I have a feeling there's a small shred of truth in this book. How big? I'm not sure. I think I leave that up to you to decide. I also feel that V.S. Naipaul lived through certain incidents that inform parts of this book. Because this book felt way too real. I really felt like I was there. I want to read a passage that I think is really important where Selim is fighting to stay out of prison with government officials, and he gets put in front of Ferdinand, who's become a very important person in the government and could decide if Selim lives or dies. And they start to talk about the future of Africa and Africans. Because Selim expresses that he is just trying to survive. He doesn't have any big ideas. And here's Ferdinand's response. You mustn't think it's bad just for you. It's bad for everybody. That's why everyone is so frantic. Everyone wants to make his money and run away. But where? That is what is driving everyone mad. They feel they are losing the place they can run back to. I feel like this is still so relevant in society today, where if you feel like you live in a place where you can't trust anyone, where can you run to so that you can feel safe? And this gets expressed multiple times in the book, that the feeling of safety or the feeling of danger was very real and very imminent to a lot of the people that lived in this town. And I think if you look at the definitions of what a high trust society is versus a low trust society, this will help us understand what is going on in this book. A low trust society is defined as one which interpersonal trust is very low or relatively low, and which do not have shared ethical values, and vice versa for a high trust society. So an example of a low trust society is Venezuela. Trust in the government is low, mass looting of grocery stores are taking place, and many people opt for fences and security if they can afford it. A high trust society is one like Sweden. Trust in the government is fairly high, crime is relatively low, and you don't have to worry about someone breaking into your car. Now, the feeling that Ferdinand has about feeling like there needs to be somewhere for him to run to sort of suggests that they live in a low trust society. Now, I found a 2007 Pew Research study that expressed how people value their society that they live in. And do they feel like they live in a high trust society, or do they feel they live in a low trust society? And when we talk about high trust society, I just want to talk that we're talking about the levels of crime and corruption people believe are occurring. It's about beliefs. So here's a quote from Pew Research. Social trust is not strongly correlated with our measurements of democracy or economic performance. It is strongly correlated with views about two other important issues, crime and corruption. In countries where people are generally trust one another, there are fewer worries about crime or corrupt political leaders. If you have a look at this graph that I'm going to put on screen, you'll be able to see that most Western societies have a fairly high trust factor about what they believe their society is. And if you look on this list, you can see a lot of African nations have a fairly low trust factor about how corrupt they believe their government is, and they have low trust in the amount of crime, etc. As in, they believe there's more crime and more corruption happening in Africa. And this is not to make the point that there are not trustworthy people in Africa or something silly like that. This is just about what people believe about crime and corruption. So how much can you trust a politician or a salesperson in your community? What people believe shapes what is actually possible in terms of safety and policing and keeping people safe and just general public order. And the same is very true in this book in terms of how public order is kept and what people believe is going to be a safe place. And believe me, most people were just saying we want to make money in this small African town and leave it because we're so worried that something's going to happen, and eventually something does. And part of the problem is you think, well, why isn't this African community safe? And it's because there's pressures from African leaders who want to control the money and European leaders who want to control the money. And that means that there's a kind of conflict. And this comes back to that value and pressure of colonialism that is very apparent throughout this book. Now, when the shops become nationalized and the big man takes over and basically steals all the profits from local businesses, Selim is forced to make a lot of difficult choices, because eventually you need to start bribing people to leave you alone, and that requires you to take more and more risks so that you have money to pay off people so they don't kill you or put you in prison. I think this is a very modern question. I think this is a question the author poses and does not try and find an answer to. I think it's a problem of modern day capitalism. Now, this book has been very much criticized for being almost pro-colonialism, almost pro-colonization. The characters that are black or tribal in this book seem savage or wild or seem not to understand what's happening around them, while the people like Salim, who's someone who seems more cultured or more educated, is somehow better in this book. Salim, who's an ethnically Indian Muslim, falls somewhere between sort of the European ideals and sort of the African ideals. So he can sort of encompass this third space where he doesn't really belong to either two groups, but he's affected by the prejudices and problems of the other two groups. And I will say the author paints a subconscious picture of some of the black characters in this book as being the dangerous characters in this book. I also wonder about the big man, because the big man feels like a combination of various political figures throughout African history that were known as either warlords or despots or people with big political ambitions that hurt a lot of normal local African people. Despite some of the misgivings I have about this book, I still highly recommend it. I think this book explores a lot of the problems that we experience today involving racism, racial power struggles, the influence of European ideals in places that are not European, and I think it's a masterful piece of writing with a very deep look into the influences in Africa of European colonial forces. I would also say, even with all the difficult events in this book, I still found a picture of a hopeful young man trying to make the sense of his own life and come out successful. And for me, this was a very hopeful book by the end of this book, even though it wasn't a perfect book by any means. So, what did you think about this novel? I'd love to know what you think about this book. I think it's an exceptional piece of writing with very difficult themes. Let me know in the comments below. Okay, that's all for now. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and you can hit the bell notification if you want to know the next time I release a new video. Next time, we will be adjusting our protractors as we go to the mountainside in The Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner. I also hope that you're enjoying some excellent reading and having an amazing, amazing week. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay curious, stay reading.